Have you ever noticed how hard it is to sit with yourself when something inside starts to stir? That quiet discomfort that feels like an itch under your skin, as if something you've buried deep down is trying to breathe again. Most people distract themselves when that happens. Turn on the TV, scroll through their phone, make small talk, anything to drown out the noise. I used to do the same. I thought peace came from keeping things under control. But the truth is, the more I tried to control myself, the more fractured I became. It's strange, the war we wage against the parts of ourselves we refuse to acknowledge. There's this idea I keep coming back to, that the person we show the world is only half of who we are. The other half lives in the shadows. Jung called it the shadow, but you can call it whatever you want, the hidden self, the denied, the shamed, the unloved. It's made up of everything we've been told not to be, every impulse we've suppressed, every emotion we've rejected, every truth we've swallowed to keep love or approval. And here's the painful irony. The parts we exile don't die. They wait. They wait for moments of weakness or heartbreak or anger, moments when the walls we've built around them crack, and then they surface. For a long time, I thought that meant something was wrong with me. I'd snap at someone and then feel guilty for days. I'd judge others harshly, only to realize later that what I hated in them was something I couldn't face in myself. It's uncomfortable to admit, isn't it, that the people who trigger us the most are often mirrors, showing us what we've refused to see. It's easier to point fingers than to look inward, easier to label someone as toxic or cruel than to ask why their behavior stirs such a reaction in us. But denial doesn't make the shadow disappear, it makes it stronger. I once met someone who seemed impossibly kind, the kind of person who always smiled, always listened, always put others first. Everyone adored her, but she was exhausted, quietly resentful, and constantly anxious. One day she told me, "I'm so tired of being good." There was so much pain in her voice, like a confession she wasn't supposed to make. She had spent her whole life suppressing her anger because she thought it made her unworthy of love. But that anger didn't vanish. It festered. It turned into passive resentment, into sleepless nights, into this deep sense of emptiness she couldn't explain. She wasn't a bad person. She was just split, torn between who she thought she should be and who she really was. I think that's what happens to so many of us. We inherit rules about what parts of us are acceptable and what parts must be buried. Be strong, don't cry, be nice, don't be selfish. And every time we obey those unspoken rules, we exile another piece of ourselves. Over time, the collection of what we've buried becomes its own creature. The part that lashes out, sabotages, lies, hides, obsesses, or numbs itself. The part that terrifies us because it reminds us we're not as pure or as good or as in control as we pretend to be. I remember once being so angry with someone that I said something cruel, something meant to hurt. The moment the words left my mouth, I regretted it. But instead of owning that anger, I drowned it in guilt. I told myself I was better than that I'd never act like that again. What I didn't realize then was that guilt wasn't growth. It was another form of avoidance. I was ashamed of the anger, not curious about it. I didn't ask what it was trying to show me, because anger, like every emotion, carries information. It's not evil. It's a messenger. And when we silence it, we silence a part of ourselves that's trying to speak. Maybe the reason some people never change isn't that they're incapable. It's that they're terrified. To change, you have to look at yourself without filters, without excuses, without the comforting illusion that you're the hero of your own story. You have to face the parts of you that disgust you, scare you, or break your heart. And that's brutal work. It's not glamorous. It's not something you post about online. It's you, sitting in silence, confronting the voice that says, "You're not who you think you are." But I've started to believe that this confrontation, this raw honesty, is where real transformation begins, not by striving to be better, but by daring to see yourself completely. The shadow isn't evil, it's misunderstood. It's the part of us that holds the power we gave away when we decided to be good. It's the creative fire, the forbidden truth, the suppressed strength. When you begin to acknowledge it, to invite it into the light, something changes. The split within you starts to heal. It's not comfortable. It feels like peeling your own skin off some days, but it's worth it. Because the moment you stop running from your shadow, you stop being ruled by it. You start to notice how it shows up. In your anger, in your jealousy, in your judgments. And instead of condemning it, you begin to listen. And listening changes everything. I don't think people are bad because they have darkness in them. I think they become lost because they refuse to face it. They build entire lives out of denial, chasing success, validation, or control, anything that keeps them from turning inward. But the shadow doesn't disappear just because we ignore it. It waits, patiently. And one day it shows itself in the very moment we least expect. Maybe that's grace in a strange way. Life giving us endless chances to meet the parts of ourselves we've abandoned. So when I think about why some people never change, I don't see it as weakness or moral failure anymore. I see it as fear. Fear of themselves. Fear of the mirror that never lies. And I think the only way forward for any of us is to stop hiding from that reflection, to stop pretending we're only light, because without the dark, we'd never see the stars. You know, the hardest thing isn't seeing the darkness in others. It's recognizing it in yourself. There's something humiliating about that moment when you realize you're capable of the very things you've condemned. It cracks your pride like glass. I remember the first time I saw it clearly, not in a grand, life-altering moment, but in something small and stupid. I was judging someone harshly for lying, and then it hit me that I had done the same thing, maybe not in the same way, but with the same motive. Fear. That realization burned. For a moment I wanted to deny it, to say, but my reasons were different. They weren't. It was my shadow looking back at me, wearing someone else's face. We like to believe we're self-aware, that we know who we are, but most of the time what we know is only our reflection in other people's eyes. We're a collection of roles and reactions, a good person, a reliable friend, a moral adult. But who are we when no one's watching? What do we say to ourselves in those quiet, unfiltered moments? That's where the truth hides, and sometimes it's unbearable. So we project it outward, the anger, the jealousy, the shame, because it's easier to see it in someone else than to own it. Jung called this projection, but it's more than a psychological mechanism. It's a form of spiritual blindness. Every judgment we cast is a little window into our own unconscious. Every irritation whispers, "There's something here you haven't accepted." Think about it. Why does one person's arrogance disgust you while another's confidence inspires you? Why does someone's neediness make you impatient while someone else's vulnerability makes you tender? It's not random. It's your shadow trying to communicate through emotion, like a child throwing stones at your window, begging you to notice. I used to think being good meant avoiding judgment altogether, but now I see that judgment is a clue. It shows me where I've disowned something in myself. The trick isn't to stop judging. It's to listen to what the judgment is trying to say. Why does this bother me? What part of me is reflected here? Those questions are like keys. They open doors into the rooms of the psyche we've kept locked for years. You can tell a lot about a person by what they hate, the things they mock, reject, or can't stand in others. Those are the unintegrated parts of themselves. The mother who despises laziness may be hiding exhaustion she's never allowed herself to feel. The man who condemns emotionality might be terrified of his own vulnerability. The friend who always needs to be right may be running from the shame of ever being wrong. It's heartbreaking once you start to see it, not because it makes you cynical, but because it makes you compassionate. You start realizing that most cruelty is just fear wearing armor. There's something liberating about catching yourself in projection. It's humbling, but it's also freeing. You start to see how your mind builds illusions to protect your ego. You stop needing everyone else to be wrong for you to be right. And in that space, empathy grows, not as a moral obligation, but as a natural consequence of understanding yourself. But make no mistake, this isn't easy work. The ego resists. It wants to preserve its image at all costs. It says, "I'm not like that," every time you get too close to the truth. It twists logic, rewrites memories, even turns morality into a weapon to defend itself. That's why transformation feels like death sometimes. Because part of you really does die. The illusion of who you thought you were has to crumble before something truer can take its place. I remember a friend telling me once, "I can't forgive my father. He's manipulative, controlling, impossible." But as she talked, I could hear in her voice the same patterns she despised, the same need to control, to shape the world around her so she wouldn't feel powerless. When I gently pointed it out, she cried, not out of anger, but recognition. "I've become him," she whispered. "No," I told her, "you've just met the part of you that understands him." That moment, painful as it was the beginning of her healing. It's strange how the heart softens when you stop dividing the world into good and bad. The more you own your darkness, the less you need to demonize others. You begin to see that we're all walking around with ghosts, different shapes, same shadows. And you start to realize that maybe forgiveness isn't about excusing behavior. Maybe it's about seeing the shared wound underneath it all. Still, most people won't go there. It's too uncomfortable. They'll cling to their judgments because it gives them a sense of control. It's easier to say they're terrible than to ask, "What does this say about me?" But those who do dare to look, even once, find something astonishing. The shadow, once faced, loses its power to scare you. You begin to notice it, even smile at it, the way you'd smile at an old friend who still knows how to push your buttons. And little by little, life changes. You stop reacting so violently. You start catching yourself before the spiral of blame begins. You pause when anger rises, not to suppress it, but to understand it. That pause, that breath of awareness, is where freedom begins. Because for the first time, you're not being dragged around by your unconscious. You're meeting it. You're saying, "I see you." It's not a one-time revelation. It's a lifelong practice. But every time you do it, something inside grows quieter, steadier, more real. You stop needing to prove yourself or hide. You stop chasing purity and start embracing wholeness. And maybe that's what healing really is. Not becoming flawless, but finally becoming complete. There comes a moment when you realize that the hardest part of healing isn't seeing your flaws. It's accepting what they mean. Because to accept them is to admit that the person you've been pretending to be isn't entirely real. That the good one, the strong one, the put-together one is, at least in part, a mask. And taking it off feels like standing naked in a room full of mirrors. Everywhere you look, there's a reflection of who you are, not who you wanted to be. It's terrifying, isn't it? The ego fights back with everything it's got. It whispers, "Don't go there. You'll lose control. You'll fall apart." And maybe, for a while, you do. Because the moment you stop defending your self-image, the whole structure begins to tremble. You start to see how many of your choices, the things you thought were noble or rational, were really built on fear, fear of being unloved, unworthy, unseen. That's the tragedy of the ego. It builds a fortress to protect you, but the same walls that keep the pain out also keep you trapped inside. You end up living in a version of yourself, polished, acceptable, approved, while your true nature suffocates beneath the surface. And when people say, "You've changed," what they often mean is, you're becoming who you were before you learned to hide. But few people ever reach that point, because to face your shadow is to question the very foundation of your identity. Imagine someone who's built their entire life around being the strong one. They're admired for it, dependable, capable, stoic. But beneath that strength lies exhaustion and loneliness. To admit that they're not as strong as they appear feels like failure. It threatens everything, their relationships, their self-worth, their place in the world. So they keep pretending, they push harder, they smile through the cracks, until one day they break. I've seen it happen. I've lived it. The collapse isn't graceful. It's raw, disorienting, humiliating even. You find yourself saying things like, "I don't know who I am anymore." But that confusion is sacred. It's the moment when illusion starts to dissolve. The ego's grip loosens, and the truth, as painful as it is, begins to seep through. You start to see the games you've played, the justifications you've built, the lies you've told yourself just to avoid feeling small. And for the first time, you realize maybe smallness isn't the enemy. Maybe it's the doorway, because once you stop defending your self-image, you make space for something far more real. Humility. And humility isn't humiliation. It's clarity. It's standing in the rubble of who you thought you were and saying, "Okay, I see now." It's not defeat, it's surrender. Not the kind that means giving up, but the kind that means letting go. Most people never taste this kind of surrender because they mistake it for weakness. They think strength means holding it together, but real strength is what happens when everything falls apart and you stay, when you don't run, when you face the parts of yourself that terrify you, the selfishness, the envy, the rage, the longing. And instead of exiling them, you sit with them, you listen, you let them speak, and when they do, you realize they were never trying to destroy you. They were trying to protect you the only way they knew how. That's the heartbreak of awareness, realizing that even your worst behavior once served a purpose. The lies, the masks, the control, they were all survival strategies. They kept you safe when you didn't know any better. And when you finally see that, something inside you softens. You stop hating yourself for the ways you've coped. You stop seeing the shadow as the enemy. You begin to understand that every part of you, even the broken, messy, shameful ones, just wanted love. But the ego doesn't give up easily. It keeps trying to rebuild itself, to find new masks, new identities to cling to. It says, "Okay, I'll be spiritual now. I'll be self-aware. I'll be healed." It's clever that way, turning even growth into performance, and you have to catch it again and again. To remind yourself that awakening isn't about becoming better, it's about becoming real. You can't skip this stage. The confrontation with the ego, the tearing down of illusions, is what separates those who transform from those who repeat the same patterns forever. It's the death before rebirth, the uncomfortable silence between who you were and who you're becoming. Most people can't bear it, so they run back to the familiar, even if it hurts. But if you can stay, if you can stand in that uncertainty long enough, something miraculous happens. You start to feel free, not in the loud, triumphant way movies show it, but in a quiet, steady way, a kind of peace that doesn't depend on approval or control. You begin to notice that the world doesn't end when you drop the act, that people don't love you less when you're honest, that life doesn't collapse when you say, "I don't know." You start to realize that everything you feared losing by being authentic, love, belonging, safety, was never truly yours until now. So yes, the ego trembles when you face your shadow, but it's not your destruction it's witnessing. It's your becoming. The death of illusion is the birth of truth. And truth, however painful, is the only ground strong enough to build a real life on. There's something deeply unsettling about seeing what happens when people refuse to look at themselves. When denial becomes a way of life, the shadow doesn't disappear. It grows. It seeps into everything: relationships, decisions, even the smallest interactions. I used to think evil was some distant, monstrous thing, something that belonged to bad people. But over time I realized it's much closer, much quieter. It begins in small moments of self-deception, the times we justify cruelty, excuse dishonesty, or pretend not to notice our own hypocrisy. That's how darkness spreads, not through villains, but through ordinary people who won't face their reflection. There was this experiment I once read about. Maybe you've heard of it. The Stanford Prison Experiment. A group of ordinary college students, some assigned to be guards, others prisoners. Within days, the guards started humiliating and abusing the prisoners. No one told them to do it. They just did. Power slipped into their hands, and something ancient and hidden took over. The experiment had to be stopped early because it got too real. What shocked me wasn't that people could be cruel. It was how easily they forgot themselves, how quickly the mask became their face. That's the thing about the shadow. When you refuse to acknowledge it, it finds a way to act without your permission. It hijacks you, and the more you deny it, the more control it gains. I think that's why we see so much unconscious cruelty in the world. People act out their pain without realizing it's their own reflection they're lashing against. They project their fear, their shame, their unhealed wounds onto others, and call it justice or righteousness or truth. History is full of this. Collective shadows masquerading as noble causes. The Holocaust, genocides, witch hunts, political purges, all born from the same blindness. People convinced they were purifying, defending, protecting, when in reality they were externalizing the very darkness they refused to confront within themselves. The scariest part isn't the cruelty itself. It's how normal it feels to those doing it. Because when a society denies its shadow, the abnormal becomes moral. But you don't have to look that far to see it. It's in everyday life, too. In gossip that feels righteous, in resentment disguised as boundaries, in judgment masquerading as truth. We all do it. I do it. Sometimes I catch myself snapping at someone only to realize later that what angered me in them was something unresolved in me. My impatience, my fear of being seen as wrong, my need to control how others perceive me. The shadow is subtle. It wears familiar faces. The body feels it before the mind does. The tension in your chest when you judge someone. The heaviness in your stomach after you've lied. Not a big lie, just a small one. The kind you tell to keep the peace. The unease that follows cruelty, even justified cruelty. Those sensations are your conscience whispering, "You've gone blind again." And when we ignore those whispers, they grow louder. They turn into anxiety, depression, or illness. The psyche will find a way to make us see what we've buried. I once read that repressed emotions are like holding a ball underwater. The more force you use to keep it down, the harder it will explode when you can't hold it anymore. That's how the shadow works. What's unacknowledged doesn't fade. It festers, and when it finally surfaces, it does so with destructive force. Through anger, breakdowns, addictions, violence. It's the soul's way of saying, "You can't ignore me forever." But even in that chaos, there's an opening. When life forces you to confront what you've hidden, you have a choice: to collapse further into denial or to wake up. The first path leads to bitterness, the second, to freedom. The only difference between people who destroy and people who transform is the courage to look at their own reflection without turning away. There's something sacred about that confrontation. It strips you of superiority. You stop dividing the world into saints and sinners because you've seen both inside yourself. You stop judging others as irredeemable because you understand how thin the line really is between virtue and vice. You stop pretending you're above it all, and instead, you start asking, where does this live in me? When you start asking that question sincerely, something changes. The energy that once went into repression begins to turn into awareness. You see anger not as evil, but as unspoken pain. You see jealousy as a sign of disconnection from your own worth. You see cruelty as an expression of fear. It doesn't make the behavior acceptable, but it makes it comprehensible, and that understanding is the seed of transformation. Maybe that's why Jung said that confronting the shadow is the work of a lifetime, because each time we think we've integrated one layer, another reveals itself. The more honest we become, the subtler the shadow gets. It hides in our virtues, in our goodness, our generosity, our ideals. Even those can become masks if we use them to avoid the discomfort of our humanity. And yet, despite all that darkness, I don't find this realization hopeless. If anything, it gives me faith, because the same force that can destroy can also heal. Once it's brought into consciousness, every act of awareness, every moment of humility, every time we say, yes, this too is me, the world becomes a little less blind. I think that's where real goodness begins, not in pretending to be light, but in owning the dark. Because when you can see your own capacity for cruelty, you stop wanting to hurt others. When you understand your own fear, you become gentler with theirs. And when you finally stop denying what you are, you stop projecting monsters into the world. You realize they were never out there. They were waiting for you, in the mirror. There's a strange kind of peace that arrives right after everything falls apart. You wouldn't expect it. At first, it's chaos. Your emotions are everywhere. Your defenses are shattered, and there's this heavy silence where your sense of self used to be. But if you stay in that silence long enough, something begins to shift. You start to see that the collapse wasn't punishment. It was an invitation. The shadow, tired of being ignored, finally forced its way to the surface, not to destroy you, but to be seen. I've been there, that breaking point where you can't pretend anymore, when the mask doesn't fit, no matter how tightly you try to hold it on. You say or do something that feels completely out of character, and afterward, you're left asking, what was that? Who was that? It's terrifying, but it's also the beginning of truth. Because that outburst, that breakdown, that mistake you can't stop replaying in your mind, that was your unconscious speaking in the only language it knows, disruption. Pain is how the shadow gets our attention. It doesn't whisper, it breaks things. The more you suppress what's inside, the louder it will fight to be heard. I used to think that my lowest moments, the times I acted recklessly or hurt people I cared about, were proof that I was broken beyond repair. Now I see them differently. They were signals. They were my soul saying, this life you're living isn't aligned with who you are. It's not pretty work, facing that truth. You have to dig through shame, guilt, regret, all the things you've buried under, I'm fine. You start seeing the patterns that ruled you, how fear disguised itself as control, how love became obligation, how kindness sometimes hid resentment. It hurts to realize how much of your life was built on unconscious repetition. But pain, as much as we hate it, is honest. It strips away delusion. It leaves you raw, yes, but also real. I remember someone telling me once, breakdowns are breakthroughs in disguise. I didn't believe it at first. Not when I was sitting in the rubble of my own mistakes, feeling like a fraud. But over time, I realized they were right. The moment you stop running, when you finally face the chaos inside you, something sacred begins to happen. The pain becomes a teacher. It starts to point the way. The key is to stop asking, "How do I get rid of this?" and start asking, "What is this trying to show me?" That shift changes everything. Suddenly, the anger you've been ashamed of reveals itself as a boundary you never learned to honor. The sadness you kept repressing shows you where you stopped being honest about your needs. Even your guilt, unbearable as it feels, becomes proof that your conscience is still alive, that there's something in you that longs for alignment. People talk about healing as if it's gentle, as if it smells like incense and sounds like meditation music. But in truth, healing often looks like losing your mind for a while. It looks like crying in your car, questioning your worth, rewriting every story you've ever told yourself. It's ugly, it's exhausting, it's humbling, and yet it's real, because for once, you're not pretending, you're not performing wellness, you're actually feeling, and feeling is where the alchemy happens. Emotions, once allowed to move, begin to transform. What you thought was anger becomes clarity. What you thought was despair becomes depth. What you thought was fear becomes power. The energy that used to be trapped in repression starts to flow again, and with it comes something you didn't expect: compassion. When you've met your own shadow, you start to understand others differently. You stop demanding perfection. You stop taking their pain personally. You can look at someone acting out, breaking down, lashing out, and instead of judgment, you feel recognition. You see the same struggle, the same desperate attempt to avoid the unbearable truth of being human. That's empathy, the kind that doesn't come from virtue, but from having crawled through the darkness yourself. I think that's why Jung said the shadow, once integrated, becomes a source of strength. Because what once terrified you now humbles you. The emotions you used to repress become tools of understanding. You stop fearing your darkness and start learning from it. And once that happens, something miraculous takes place. The war inside you begins to quiet. You realize that your shadow was never trying to ruin you. It was trying to make you whole. It wanted to show you the parts of yourself that you abandoned: your truth, your power, your sensitivity, your depth. And though it had to break you to get your attention, it did so out of necessity, not malice. Because what else could reach a person determined to stay asleep? So when I look back now, I don't see those painful moments as failures anymore. I see them as thresholds, sacred points of no return. Because after the breaking, after the storm, after the silence, something new always emerges. Not a cleaner version of who you were, but a truer one. Someone who doesn't need to hide. Someone who can finally look in the mirror and say, without shame, "Yes, all of this is me." There's a turning point somewhere after the storm, when the question shifts from "Why is this happening to me?" to "What is this teaching me?" That's when real change begins. Not the superficial kind, but the slow, quiet transformation that starts deep inside and moves outward. You begin to notice the subtle moments when the old self tries to take control again. The urge to defend, to hide, to prove. But this time, instead of reacting, you pause. You take a breath. You ask yourself, what part of me is speaking right now? And for the first time, you actually listen. That's what shadow work really is. Not some mystical ritual, but the practice of paying attention to the patterns, to the triggers, to the parts of you that make you uncomfortable. The goal isn't to get rid of them, but to understand them. You start tracing your emotions back to their roots, following the threads through your memories. You ask, when did I first feel this? And often, what you find isn't evil or brokenness. It's a wound. A child who learned that anger was dangerous. A teenager who decided that vulnerability meant weakness. An adult who built armor out of control because softness once led to pain. I used to think healing meant becoming good. Now I see it means becoming whole. The difference is enormous. Good is a performance, a role you play so others won't reject you. But whole is acceptance. It's looking at yourself with clear eyes and saying, yes, even this part belongs. And when you do that, something inside relaxes. You stop fighting yourself. You stop wasting energy trying to exile what's already part of you. The process is simple, but not easy. First, you notice. You see the emotion rising and name it. Anger, envy, fear, shame. Then you ask where it comes from, not as an accusation, but as a question of care. Then you take responsibility. You stop blaming the world for what's unresolved in you. That's the hardest part, the radical honesty of saying, this reaction is mine. And then you find a healthy way to express it. Sometimes that means writing, sometimes moving, sometimes talking to someone you trust. The form doesn't matter as much as the intention, to bring what was hidden into the light. And you repeat this, again and again. Integration isn't a one-time revelation, it's a lifelong practice of remembering and returning. Some days you'll fall back into old habits, numbness, denial, self-criticism, but even that becomes part of the work. You start to see relapse not as failure but as feedback. The psyche has rhythms like the tide, expansion and contraction, clarity and confusion. You learn to trust the rhythm instead of resisting it. The beauty of this process is that it changes how you see others too. When you start integrating your own shadow, you stop needing to fix or judge people for theirs. You realize everyone's just trying to find their way home to themselves. The people who trigger you the most become your greatest teachers. The situations that used to break you become opportunities to practice staying conscious. The world stops being a battlefield and starts becoming a mirror. I remember the first time I caught myself before repeating an old pattern. Someone said something that, months before, would have sent me spiraling, defensive, angry, hurt. But this time I just noticed the reaction rise and fall like a wave passing through, and in that moment I felt something incredible. Space, the freedom to choose. That's what awareness gives you. It doesn't erase the shadow, it gives you room to dance with it. And the more you do this, the softer life feels. Not because it gets easier, but because you're no longer at war with yourself. You start to see your darkness as a source of strength. Your anger becomes courage. Your sadness becomes empathy. Your fear becomes wisdom. The same energy that once destroyed you begins to heal you because now it's integrated, acknowledged, honored. When you reach that point, you begin to understand what Jung meant when he said, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." Enlightenment isn't about floating above your humanity. It's about descending fully into it, without shame, without denial, without the need to be perfect. And maybe that's what true freedom looks like, walking through life with all your parts intact, knowing you are both the storm and the calm, both the light and the shadow. You don't need to hide anymore. You don't need to explain. You just exist, whole, imperfect, and astonishingly human. You can always tell when someone has never faced themselves. There's a restlessness in them, a constant need to prove something, to be right, to be admired, to stay in control. They move through life chasing validation like air, terrified of silence, because silence is where the truth lives. I used to think those people were arrogant. Now I just see fear. Fear of the mirror. Fear of the collapse that comes when the lies you've built about yourself finally stop working. That fear runs deep. It's why so many people stay stuck in the same patterns for years. The same arguments, the same heartbreaks, the same disappointments dressed in different faces. It's not that they can't change. It's that change requires honesty, and honesty requires pain. You can't build a new life without tearing down the old one. and most people would rather suffer in the familiar than risk being undone by the unknown. There's a story I can't stop thinking about, not about someone famous, but someone ordinary, a man who built his entire life around being successful. He had everything that should have made him happy: career, family, respect. But beneath the surface there was this quiet desperation. He was always busy, always achieving, always planning anything to avoid the stillness, because in stillness he felt the emptiness, that subtle ache of knowing he was living someone else's definition of fulfillment. One day, everything he worked for started to unravel, not because of bad luck, but because the foundation was built on fear, the fear of being ordinary, the fear of being unworthy unless he was winning. When it all fell apart, he was forced to confront what he'd been running from his whole life: himself. He said something that stuck with me. It's strange. I spent my whole life chasing admiration, but the moment I stopped trying to impress anyone, I finally felt free. That's the paradox. The freedom we crave doesn't come from control. It comes from surrender. From letting the truth burn away the illusions we've built. From admitting that we're not as virtuous or perfect as we want to believe, and realizing that we don't have to be. The ego hates this. It fights for survival like a trapped animal. It will justify, manipulate, project anything to protect the story of who you think you are. It will say, you're not like them, you're better. It will say, it's not your fault. And in those moments, you have a choice: stay asleep or wake up. To wake up is to admit, I was wrong, I was afraid, I've been pretending. And while that honesty might feel like death, it's actually rebirth, because every illusion you let go of brings you closer to yourself. You start to see how much energy you wasted maintaining a facade, how many opportunities you missed because you were too afraid to be seen as imperfect, how much love you pushed away because you didn't believe you deserved it unless you were flawless. The moment you stop running, you begin to grow, slowly, awkwardly, painfully, but genuinely. You stop needing to be right all the time. You stop seeking applause. You stop confusing control with safety. You start asking different questions, not how do I look or what do they think, but am I being true? Am I kind? Am I awake? And as you ask those questions, something shifts inside you. You realize that the people who never change aren't cursed or hopeless. They're scared. They've built prisons out of their personas. Every defense mechanism, every excuse, every layer of denial is a brick in the wall between them and the truth. And no one can break that wall for them. They have to do it themselves, from the inside out. But for those who dare, who let the wall crack, who let the light in, something extraordinary happens. They start to live, not perform, not pretend, but live. They make mistakes and own them. They feel anger and express it without cruelty. They love without disguising their fear. They're not perfect, but they're real. And you can feel it when you're around them, that quiet authenticity that doesn't need to prove anything. So when I think about why some people never change, I don't see evil anymore. I see pain disguised as pride. I see children who learned too early that love had to be earned. I see adults still carrying that lesson, terrified of what will happen if they stop pretending. But if they only knew, if they could face themselves just once, honestly, without defense, they'd see that the monster they've been avoiding was never the enemy. It was the part of them that wanted to be free. There's a kind of freedom that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't come with fireworks or triumph. It arrives quietly, like the moment you realize you're no longer afraid of your own reflection. You wake up one day and notice that you're not hiding anymore. You're not performing. You're not editing your words to sound acceptable or shrinking parts of yourself to fit into someone else's comfort zone. You're just there, present, imperfect, alive. This freedom doesn't mean life gets easy. It just means you've stopped resisting it. You no longer demand that everything makes sense or feel good. You let things be what they are. You let yourself be what you are. The fear, the doubt, the beauty, the mess, it's all part of it. You realize that the point was never to win at being human, but to experience it fully. To live the questions instead of rushing to answers. It's strange, though. The more whole you become, the more you see how fragmented the world is. You start noticing how many people are still at war with themselves, smiling while breaking inside, preaching love while avoiding their own pain. You don't judge them anymore. You understand now they're still running from their shadows, just as you once did. You remember how terrifying it felt to stand still and look, and so you meet them with gentleness instead of criticism. That's the quiet revolution of self-awareness. It ripples outward. When you stop projecting your darkness onto others, you stop needing to punish them for reflecting it back. You see the world not as a battlefield, but as a classroom. Everyone's learning at their own pace. Everyone's trying to come home to themselves. And the only thing that truly helps is understanding. Compassion stops being a virtue and becomes a natural reflex. Because you've tasted your own suffering and found wisdom in it. You also start to love differently, more slowly, more truthfully. You don't chase or cling the way you used to because you no longer need someone else to fill the spaces you've learned to inhabit yourself. You can sit in solitude without mistaking it for loneliness. You can let people go without turning it into tragedy. Love stops being a negotiation for safety and becomes an expression of presence. I see you as you are, and I'm here. And perhaps the most profound thing is this. When you integrate your shadow, you stop being afraid of other people's darkness too. You no longer flinch when someone shows their anger or sadness or shame. You don't rush to fix them or pull away. You can sit beside them in their pain without trying to erase it, because you know now that darkness isn't the opposite of light. It's the cradle of it. The world starts to feel wider. You start to feel lighter. Even the hard days carry a quiet grace because you know they're part of the rhythm. Expansion, contraction, loss, renewal. Life stops feeling like a test you have to pass and becomes a mystery you're allowed to experience. You make peace with not knowing. You trust that everything, the beauty, the heartbreak, the uncertainty, is shaping you into something whole. And maybe that's what real enlightenment is. Not the end of pain, but the end of running from it. Not the destruction of the ego, but the softening of it. The humility of knowing you're both the light and the shadow, both the wound and the healer. You stop trying to transcend your humanity and start cherishing it. You start to see that the soul's deepest longing isn't for perfection. It's for intimacy. To be fully known, even by yourself. I think about this often, how the journey through darkness never really ends, but it changes. It becomes less about struggle and more about presence. You stop searching for salvation and start living as someone who's already found it, here in the middle of your imperfect, miraculous existence. And maybe that's the point of all of it. Not to escape the shadow, not to defeat it, but to walk beside it, hand in hand. To let it remind you every day that being human is not a punishment, but a privilege. That to feel deeply, to fall and rise and fall again, to love and lose and still keep your heart open, that is the most courageous thing any of us can do.